All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our presentation on linguistic justice.
Before we get started, we wanted to introduce ourselves. My name is Camila. I use any pronouns. I'm a social justice educator, as well as a Joy de la Cruz art and activism intern. And I'm majoring in sociology with a concentration in social inequity.
Hey, everyone. My name is Mira Gupta. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a social justice educator, as well as the other Joy de la Cruz art and activism intern, and I am a global health major.
Before we dive into our presentation today, we want to start with a land acknowledgement. UCSD resides on the unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation. The UCSD community holds great respect for the land and the indigenous people that first resided where we are currently located. Furthermore, we want to acknowledge that the Kumeyaay people continue to have political sovereignty and cultural traditions as vital members of the San Diego community. We acknowledge and continue to amplify and uplift the Kumeyaay Nation for their contributions to the UCSD community and the greater San Diego area. This statement was adopted from the UCSD Intertribal Resource Center. And if you're tuning in to us today from somewhere that's not in the San Diego area or not on Kumeyaay land, you can input your zip code into that website, which is native-land.ca. As part of our land acknowledgement, I wanted to quickly show y'all a visual representation of how Kumeyaay land looks today. So on the map to the left side, you will see that's what Kumeyaay lands look like from 1769 up until 2000. Or that's just like a general map. As you can see, Kumeyaay land pre-exists the border wall and also borders the ocean. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because Kumeyaay actually means those who face the ocean from the cliffs. But if you look at the map on the right, you'll see that all the reservations of the region are actually really far east and in very, very small areas. And so I just wanted to share this with you all because it really speaks to the displacement of Indigenous folks.
All right, now before we begin, I also wanted to break down some of what we're going to be discussing today. So firstly, what is linguistic justice and why it's important? Next, language and systems of power and how these systems of power affect our ability to use language at school and work. And then what is AAVE and the components of African-American Vernacular English? And lastly, the appropriation of AAVE and how it's adopted into mainstream media.
So the first section of our presentation today, we'll be talking about what exactly linguistic justice is and why it's so important. So the definition we'll be using throughout our presentation for linguistic justice is being able to speak and express oneself freely in the language one is most comfortable in. And so we'll be referencing this throughout the rest of the presentation. And why is it so important? In the US alone, there are over 350 different languages spoken in homes, and about 20% of US families speak an entirely different language other than English. This great diversity in language should be celebrated. Yet in many cases, the ability to speak English is viewed as a necessary skill in schools and in workplaces. The prioritization of English over other languages is a form of oppression because languages are intricately connected with cultures. And by demanding that someone learns a language, it is essentially a form of forced assimilation into an English-speaking culture. Not to mention, there are so many benefits to being able to speak more than one language. Being able to speak multiple languages is a skill that should be celebrated and honored. Recent studies have shown that kids who grew up speaking more than one language, or even exposed to people who can speak more than one language, tend to have a deeper sense of empathy for other cultures and other types of people. They also tend to have better learning abilities and even reduced risks for mental diseases such as Alzheimer's, as well as an increase in our cognitive flexibility, which is essentially the ability for our brain to be able to think about multiple concepts simultaneously. And so being multilingual or speaking more than one language gives us the ability of increased awareness, adaptability, and more confidence. I wanted to share this video with you all now. It's a TED Talk by Karen Leong. It's called Embracing Multilingualism and Eradicating Linguistic Bias.
大家好，我個名係梁家偉，我今日想同你講關於語言歧視。I'm just kidding. I heard some sighs of relief. Were you expecting me to continue in Cantonese? Now that I've switched to English, were you expecting an accent? If you did, you are not the only one. I'm not sure if you've thought about this before, but this kind of stereotyping is a form of discrimination. Throughout my family's time here in the US, we have faced discrimination due to our race, ethnicity, culture, and the use of our language. To give you a bit more background on my family, I would like to introduce you to the two most intelligent people I know. The two people beside me in this photo are my parents. They're geniuses. They're ridiculously smart. They taught themselves how to read and write traditional Chinese, how to speak Mandarin, how to play multiple instruments, and have thrived since coming to the US. The only questionable thing I like to joke about them doing is that they named my siblings and I Carmen, Karen, and Ricky. That's not even the worst part. The R sound that exists in English does not exist in Cantonese. So instead, they have to accommodate for it with a W sound, which makes us Kaman, K1, and Wiki. My poor brother. Now, my parents, they know English, they're just not fluent. And they can speak English, just not the way a native English speaker would, like I am right now. Let me give you an example. Say I have a guest over at my house for dinner. Out of courtesy, it's obvious I would ask something like, "Are you full?" or "Have you had enough to eat?" My parents in this situation would ask, "You eat full yet?" Which may not follow conventional English grammatical structure, but it is still understandable. This sentence shows incredible linguistic abilities. In the sentence, my parents are using English vocabulary words paired with Cantonese sentence structure. "You eat full yet" is directly translated from the Cantonese equivalent of "Have you had enough to eat?" which is "你食飽未?" This proves to us that my parents are very knowledgeable in both Cantonese and English. Yet, they're still seen as unintelligent. Their English is still labeled as broken. And we still hear things like, "Speak American. You're in America now, so speak like it." This is an example of discrimination that immigrant families experience in our communities and in our country. So let's explore this idea of speaking American. True or false? The United States has an official language. Follow up, true or false? The official language of the United States is English. Okay, you guys were right. That's false. I had a whole thing about like, believe it or not, it's false. So the United States does not have an official language. So why are there so many people out there who think that there is? And why are people like my parents being told to speak American when American isn't even a language in and of itself if you've ever taken any language classes? And I have another question for you guys. Give me a show of hands. How many of you have taken a foreign language in school before? Wow, almost everyone. How many of you would say it was pretty challenging? All of you. And now, the hard question. How many of you, with their hands up just now, would be comfortable moving to a country that speaks primarily that foreign language, with the amount that you know. I lost like 90% of hands. I took French and I'm not moving to France ever. This is what immigrant people experience when they move to the US and start learning English. The only difference is that native English speakers learning a foreign language don't receive the same social shame that an immigrant would when they learn English as a second or even third language. Instead, a native English speaker learning any foreign language receives praise. Why is that? This is a double standard that we need to do.
So what is your favorite way to communicate with your favorite language, your favorite way to communicate with others? And make sure to set the chat to everyone so we can all see what you have to say. I will share my answer to this question while you all brainstorm or think. So I'm Mexican German American, and both of my parents are immigrants. And so in my household growing up, I would speak both Spanish and German, and then I would speak English with my friends and at school. I also went to a bilingual two-way immersion school, and so at school I would speak in Spanish and in English. And so I, over the years, as I've started using all of my language skills, now I mostly communicate in English, but my favorite way to communicate with others is probably like a mix of all three languages, just because sometimes I'll be talking and I'll forget a word in one language and I'll substitute it with a word in a different language. Obviously, this means that when I'm communicating this way, I'm probably communicating with people who are also bilingual or multilingual, so my family, for example. Another way that I like to communicate with people that's not necessarily through language or through writing is through art. I think art is a really great way of being able to communicate my emotions, my feelings, even like history. So that's my favorite way to communicate. Someone said that their favorite language to communicate in is Spanish. Definitely. I think it's also like easier and more fun to communicate in a language that you grew up speaking. It's just like more familiar to you. All right. Does anyone have anything else to add? Bengali, yes, and French. Those are both very cool languages.
We'll be talking about language and systems of power, and like I mentioned earlier, how these systems affect our language use at school and work. To language and systems of oppression, scholars have defined language oppression as the enforcement of language loss by physical, mental, social, and spiritual coercion. So what does this mean? Language oppression is a form of domination that is coherent with other forms of oppression along the lines of race, nationality, skin color, ethnicity, and so forth. And we can recognize that capitalism and white supremacy, more specifically to the US, are the two systems of oppression by which language then becomes a source of discrimination, as we saw in the video. So when it comes to education in schools, there's a lot of misconceptions about language, which perpetuates racism and xenophobia, right? So as we saw in the video, language, there's this double standard about language in that it's used in a way to discriminate against immigrant families. And an example that I have is the use of standardized testing and the fact that it's biased against multilingual students, especially BIPOC students, which stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. Standardized testing specifically includes English vocabulary and word comprehension questions that may not be as accessible to students who come from a bilingual or multilingual background. And this also speaks to a greater issue of systemic oppression, because standardized testing scores can impact the funding for schools, especially if you go to a zone school or public high school. And so language bias in standardized testing compounds to a school maybe not getting as many resources and opportunities to help kids succeed. So if a zone school, public school is receiving lower grades on their language tests, they might not be able to have access to materials to be able to learn other languages or to be able to succeed. So we're not only seeing this discrimination on a language basis on a smaller scale, but on a larger scale as well. Now, language oppression in the workforce. This topic was actually really interesting to me because I didn't really think that there was, because we do have civil rights laws that protect folks, but unfortunately, language discrimination in the workplace is still a very common practice. So for example, companies that may have, English only policies, they may also be disproportionately hiring folks who do not have an accent from a different language over those who do. And there's also cases of harassment and hostility towards employees in using a different mother tongue. And these are issues that don't just pertain to one particular industry, but it's something that is universally experienced.
All right, so in this next section, we're going to be talking about what exactly AAVE is, or African-American Vernacular English, and all of its different grammatic and phonetic components. So what exactly is AAVE? AAVE is an acronym for African-American Vernacular English. It's also referred to as African-American Language, Black English Vernacular. There's a whole lot of different ways to refer to it. AAVE is a dialect of English, just like British English, and it has its own grammar, its own vocabulary, and its own phonology, and it's primarily spoken by Black people in the United States and in Canada. Sorry. Before we get into this presentation, I wanted to share a video where the woman you see, her name is Sierra. She really breaks down what AAVE is, its history, and its different grammatic components. So we're going to be watching about 4 minutes from the whole video.
What exactly is AAVE? In the most simple terms, it's the way that many Black Americans communicate with one another that has evolved and continues to evolve over the last few centuries. Please note that AAVE differs between states and regions, so this is simply a general overview of the dialect. There's not a single origin story when it comes to the history of AAVE. We can make a linguistic connection back to the many enslaved Black Americans brought over to North America over 400 years ago. The ongoing argument is whether AAVE is simply a variant adapted from the Germanic American English overheard on plantations, or if it's an entirely separate Creole that evolved from contact between English and several West African languages. The Creole theory still holds up because AAVE shares many pronunciation and structural similarities with other African-based Creoles around the globe. At the same time, AAVE is a lot closer structurally and pronunciation-wise to standard American English compared to Gullah or Louisiana Creole. Much of AAVE's grammar and phonology are heavily comparable to rural dialects across the American South. So the debate around AAVE's origins continues. In the era of Jim Crow and rampant deadly attacks from the Ku Klux Klan, many Black people relocated from the South. With this migration, millions of African Americans brought their culture and AAVE dialect with them to their new homes. So New York's AAVE doesn't sound exactly the same as Detroit's. This long, storied history that dates back over 100 years can't be reduced to internet slang. So, what are some of the features that many of the forms of AAVE share? One distinctive feature of the dialect is its grammar, specifically verb conjugations. Let's take a look at the present tense. In standard American English, you would say she doesn't like, whereas in AAVE, you would say she don't like. So we can see that in AAVE, the verb to do is conjugated in the third person plural, rather than the third person singular. Next up is the present progressive tense, which is used to explain something that is happening in real time. For example, Nadine is going shopping. But in AAVE, you would drop the is and just say Nadine going shopping. Parts of the verb, like is and are often dropped in AAVE because the meaning is already implied. Now, if someone said Nadine be going shopping, this has an entirely different meaning and brings us into the territory of the habitual be. The habitual be signifies that something is often or usually done. So, from our example sentence of Nadine be going shopping, the listener understands that, dang, Nadine really loves to shop and does it frequently. And depending on the tone in which this is said, it could imply that Nadine is a shopaholic. But like in most languages, context and tone can have a huge impact on meaning. In AAVE, you might hear someone say ax instead of the traditional ask, or library instead of library. This is called metathesis, which involves switching around sounds and words. Although metathesis is a part of the dialect, non-AAVE speakers often make fun of it and/or discredit it. Unfortunately, it's not uncommon for this metathesis to be corrected in schools. This is particularly common when Black children are in predominantly white school districts. Although this is valuable knowledge when speaking and learning standard American English, it's important for educators to realize that AAVE is its own dialect. Once this is acknowledged, educators can explain to students that their dialect at home is super rich and important, but there are certain rules to follow when speaking standard American English. It's important to note that one dialect is not more correct than another. However, people who dismiss AAVE as an internet phenomenon for young people are actually erasing over 400 years of culture, heritage, and linguistic development. AAVE speakers have been historically discriminated against.
I wanted to break down a few of the things that Sierra talked about in her video. First, I wanted to talk about where exactly AAVE comes from. So AAVE, or African-American Vernacular English, was born in the American South, and it shares many features with Southern American English. However, it was born out of the history of enslavement of Black people in the United States. Black Americans, by and large, did not voluntarily come to North America with like-minded people and people of shared backgrounds and cultural backgrounds, as happened with waves of British, Irish, Italian, German, and Dutch immigrants. Rather, people came from different cultures and languages, were torn from their homelands, sold into chattel slavery, and were systematically segregated from speakers of their own languages. And so what happens when these people are isolated and forced to communicate with people who don't speak their own language in a completely different continent? It means that a whole bunch of different languages are kind of getting mashed together in order for them to be able to communicate with each other. And that's essentially where AAVE started. And so there's two different competing hypotheses about the linguistic origins of AAVE, neither which linguists will ever be able to fully prove, because the history of the US has completely obscured the origins of the dialect. Because of historical racism, we're left with hypothesis instead of documentation or evidence. And so the first hypothesis is the Creole origin hypothesis that Sierra touched upon in her video. And so essentially what this hypothesis is that contact between English speakers and speakers of a variety of different languages when Black people came to the United States led to the formation of a Creole language with an English superstrate, but with strong Pan-African grammatical influences, meaning that there's a lot of English words, but it's still distinct from English because it pulls on a lot of different African languages. The next hypothesis is the dialect divergence hypothesis. And this second hypothesis is the theory that African-American language is basically a sister dialect of Southern American English, which started to diverge into its own dialect in the 1700s and 1800s. So I wanted to talk about a few of the linguistic components of AAVE. These are just a few of the many that exist, but I felt that these are some of the most common ones that you hear when someone speaks AAVE. So the first is the deletion of a verbal copula. And that means that in some contexts, the word is or are is left out. So for example, you would say, he working instead of he is working. Another component is a habitual aspect marker, known as a habitual B, which Sierra mentioned in her video. And this aspect refers to whether an action is completed or ongoing. So habitual aspect means that a person regularly or usually does a certain task or thing, but does not give any indication as to whether they are currently in the process of doing that thing. So for example, you would say, he be working, instead of saying he is usually working. Another component is a remote present perfect marker, which stresses the been. So this communicates that not only is something the case and not only is it completed, but it has been completed for a long time. So for example, you would say, he been got a job, which means he got a job a long time ago. Another component of AAVE is a negative concord. And this means that negation has to all match, and it is often stigmatized in standardized American English. Maybe you've heard or been told not to use double negatives, but in many other languages and dialects, that is totally normal, and AAV is one of those. So for example, you would say, he ain't never without a job, can't nobody say he don't work, which means he always has a job, he is working, and no one can say otherwise. The next component of AAV that I wanted to share is using it for the dummy expletive there. So in contexts where speakers of other dialects might say there, some AAVE speakers would say it. So for example, it's a man at the door here to see you, which means there is a man at the door here to see you. And finally, the preterite had, this refers to grammatical constructions that in other dialects do not use had, but use the simple past tense. And it's usually used in narrative. So for example, you would say, he had went to work, then he had called his client, which means he went to work and then he called his client. So I wanted to share with you all these examples of AAVE. I'm sure you all have seen or heard people use them either in real life or on Instagram and on TikTok. I know that I have words like boo, bae, finna, woke, go off, fam. Those are just a few examples of vocabulary that is a part of AAVE and has been rebranded as internet slang or TikTok slang, which Mira will be talking about more thoroughly in the next section.
Yes, so now we will be diving into the appropriation of AAVE and how it's been adapted into mainstream media. Before we begin though, I just wanted to explain this video a little bit. She's going to be talking about the appropriation of Black language, AAVE, as well as literacy, identity, and pedagogy.
Growing up in Detroit, Black language always reflected people's lived experiences, their ways with the world. It reflected the culture. It reflected so many things. My parents were big on Black history. They were big on activism. And so, this is how I wanted to be in the classroom.
And it's important to make sure the kids stay focused and not falling out of education because you think they're not talking properly.
However, it wasn't until I started teaching on the east side of Detroit when I entered into what Geneva Smitherman calls the language wars. My name is April Baker Bell. I am an assistant professor at Michigan State University in the Department of English and African-American and African Studies. I am a language literacy and English education scholar. The title of my book is Linguistic Justice, Black Language, Literacy, Identity, and Pedagogy. When you grow up in a Black space like Detroit, you're going to hear people speaking Black language. I always marveled at the way that people in my community would use language. For me, Black people use language in a way that was powerful, colorful, and very unique. Marcelina Morgan calls this concept the mother tongue. This Black language is the language that, socialized me and nurtured me, and it really taught me how to understand the world and how to participate in it. I started working with students who were communicating in Black language just like me, but I remember feeling pressure by school administrators to get these kids to use the language of school, if you will. And so I do remember this conversation with my students, this myth of standard English, and one of the students said, "What I look like speaking like that? It don't even sound right." And then there were other students in the class that said, "Well, you can't go anywhere talking ghetto like that." And I remember, as a teacher, not having the tools to talk about language politics, not being properly prepared to have that conversation, although I knew the kids were speaking the truth. What were your initial thoughts when you read those two language samples?
It reminded me of like someone that's not as educated.
I disagree. That's how you was raised and what you grew up with.
It's the language you use when you're around your friends.
Right. We tend to think of somebody that communicates this way as uneducated, and then you all are pushing on that and saying that doesn't mean you're uneducated because this is the way we communicate with our family and friends. So now the challenge for me was, dealing with that pressure from school and working with the students who were having real conversations about language and race and language and culture and things that I didn't have the opportunity to speak back to. That's when my research started. What I found out was that many classrooms operated like linguistic and cultural battlegrounds. Students were being silenced and alienated just because of the way that they talk. In some ways internalizing what I'm calling anti-Black linguistic racism. They were experiencing anti-Blackness in and through their language. This internalization, it's not just with students. My mother have told me stories about how she experienced anti-Black linguistic racism. So then my goal began to really respond to those needs. Like, how can I change, the attitudes that they have about themselves, that they have about their language. Linguistic Justice, the book and the framework, is about Black language and Black liberation. It's really about dismantling anti-Black linguistic racism and white linguistic hegemony, getting Black youth to really feel proud of a language that their ancestors created. Black language was once the most studied and written about language in the world. But here I am, this teacher teaching in Detroit, and I had no idea that this existed. The pedagogy that I'm working with, it's really looking into the history. It's really allowing students to have an opportunity to talk about language and race, the things that they experience. So what happened is, despite that, enslaved Africans created Black language out of the remnants of their mother tongue, like West African languages and part of the English language, to create their own. It's important for me to be in classrooms, working alongside youth, working alongside teachers, and getting this work in the hands of folks that need it the most.
I think it'll help kids know that they can be themselves in the classroom. You know what I'm saying? They can be where they're from, and not be looked down upon based on where they're from or the language they're using.
If kids feel inferior, that they're not gonna learn anyway if you feel inferior. So I don't think it's even just for teachers and kids, but it's for anybody, Black, not Black, and want to learn more. I think that the book is there. But ultimately, my goal is to get them to see the beauty in it, and that there's nothing wrong with the way in which they communicate. That's what the goal of this pedagogy is ultimately to do.
After watching this video, I wanted to address some of the nuances of language oppression. So language oppression, still occurs in education in the workforce, as I mentioned earlier. And despite the fact that AAVE is mocked and regarded as unprofessional, or if someone is speaking AAVE, they're considered uneducated, as mentioned in the video, AAVE has been appropriated and rebranded as internet slang, as mentioned before. And it's with the intent, typically, of creating clout amongst white and other non-Black people online. And so non-Black folks will use AAVE or use a Black scent, which is inauthentically putting on a Black persona or adopting a Black scent to garner attention online, and usually in the form of laughs or for comedy purposes. But whether or not people realize that they're using AAVE or having a Black scent, it still perpetuates the stereotypes already placed on the Black community. And something that I also wanted to note is that there's a lot of similarity with the appropriation of AAVE and the subtle racism of that in the era of the internet. And it's comparable to minstrel shows historically. So there were shows where folks would dress up in blackface and would, overdraw their lips to make them look bigger, to essentially mock Black people and the Black community. And so when we see or we hear folks using a Black accent who are not Black, it's essentially this sort of newer version of this sort of subtle racism under the guise of entertainment purposes. So we see the nuance of AAVE being mocked and Black culture being ridiculed and discriminated against, yet everyone seemingly wants to partake in this culture and emulate it. And as I mentioned earlier, and as was mentioned in the video, students who use AAVE at home, who go into school, get discriminated against. And so we can, as Sierra mentioned earlier in the other video, we can reframe education and even the culture in the workforce to highlight and uplift the validity of AAVE and honor the rich history that it has for the Black community without appropriating it. And we can highlight the grammatical education of standard American English without discrediting AAVE. I also wanted to touch on this idea, like I mentioned earlier, of how non-Black people want to emulate Blackness without taking on any of the real systemic racism and discrimination that has occurred historically by being Black in America. With that, I wanted to provide some examples of AAVE and the appropriation of AAVE in the media. We've seen, I'm sure y'all are familiar with some of the internet personalities such as Bad Baby, Woah Vicky, Brittany Broski, and Spencer on TikTok. Something that I want to note is that all of these folks are in fact white and have used AAVE and or Black sense in their content. And so when these internet personalities were being called out, they would use excuses such as, oh, it's just internet slang, it's just how I talk, or I grew up in, this so-and-so neighborhood, and so that's why I talk the way that I talk. And another example is that people typically on TikTok or other social media platforms will dub audios of Black people, more specifically Black women, talking, and will lip sync it as, and this is also considered another subtle form of the appropriation of AAVE. Before we continue on, I did also want to mention that as we are bringing up this information to y'all, it's not necessarily an attack or saying, you're a bad person because you've used AAVE or Black accent in the past. It's really just a reminder of the fact that we all need to educate ourselves on the language that we use. And, as folks, like as Camila mentioned, their parents are immigrants. And so even if you've experienced the forms of language oppression or linguistic injustice, we also need to focus on the ways in which we can correct our behavior so we're not perpetuating anti-Blackness and so we're not perpetuating these systems of oppression.
I also wanted to add on to what Mira was just talking about, how internet personalities will take on a Black accent and they'll use AAVE. Not only will they use the language, but they'll also start adopting parts of African-American culture. Like they'll wear big hoops and they'll get really long acrylics. And it's just, they do it without the knowing the historical context, and they do it because they know it'll get them clout and they know that they can profit off of it.
And so we have another discussion question for y'all. When have you or someone else used AAVE, and when have you heard people using AAVE? I can speak on my experience while y'all are typing in the chat. In middle school and in high school, I've definitely been exposed to AAVE through my Black peers, my Black friends, but I've also, growing up in New York City, you're exposed to a lot of diverse cultures, and AAVE was something that a lot of people, including non-Black folks, were using. And I remember in high school, everyone was saying period, or other forms of AAVE like deadass, or some of the words that we were listing earlier. And so in the past, I definitely have used AAVE, and without really realizing the historical context of AAVE and what that means in terms of my positionality. And so I think that making this presentation was really illuminating me to all of the really intricate grammatical structures of AAVE, and it made me really appreciate it more because I didn't understand that earlier, and I didn't understand the consequences of me in my positionality using AAVE. So
similar to Mira, I grew up in the Bay Area, and I got to experience a lot of different cultures and different types of people. And so I definitely heard a lot of African-American vernacular English growing up. But I think where I heard it most was on TikTok. And I actually started to adopt a lot of AAVE, not knowing that it was AAVE. I just thought it was TikTok language or internet slang. And so I actually got into the habit of saying period a lot, and like an obnoxious amount, actually. Like I said it a little bit too much. Like it became almost like a marker of my personality. And so I said period all the time. And actually Mira was the one who called me out on it. And so after she called me out on it, I went and, did my research on AAVE and like the historical background of African-American vernacular English. And I started to, change my perspective on language and how in my language choices, and I am upholding certain systems of oppression, or I'm upholding stereotypes, even if it's not my intention to do so. That's what I was doing. It looks like someone in the chat said that they've heard it from teens, especially in high school, and they did not know the meaning behind it, but they are grateful to have learned through this presentation. I'm so glad. And Mira and I were talking about that as well, like even just like learning about like the historical background of a language, like it gives you so much insight, because now you know why it's harmful, and it makes you not want to harm others, right? They also said it would be helpful to know how to properly educate people who use it without being rude. Yes, totally. That's such a valid question that we're actually gonna talk about a little bit.
When we talk about AAVE as non-Black people in this non-Black space, it's important to call folks out. And when calling folks out, I think there is a misconception that it's an attack, or it's saying, you are a bad person because you did X, Y, Z. But it's really calling out a behavior, and it's really calling folks in, actually, and really calling them in to educate them. And so we have some tips to stop appropriating AAVE. So for example, we have checking yourself first and foremost, noticing and observing when you are using AAVE. Camila brought up her own personal experience of noticing once I called her in, and the way that we approached our conversation was really just, me coming to her as a friend saying, hey, I've noticed you've been using period a lot. Maybe let's rethink, how we're using this language, and the fact that this is language that is not from our own culture, and we can still admire it, and we can still appreciate it without appropriating it, and without and with knowing the historical context of it. There's also finding substitutes for certain words. So instead of saying period, you could say, I love that, or you could say, that's amazing, or any other compliment, because usually period is used in the context of praise, or of, praising someone or praising something, or showing agreement. So you can communicate that with using other words. And so I think reframing your mind to understanding that just as easy as it is to develop the habit of saying period or using AAVE, it's just as easy to unlearn that. And it's just as easy to develop other language habits and not appropriate. Also, checking your friends and your family members who use AAVE, who are not Black. I think that, like I mentioned earlier, making sure to really call folks in is really not an attack. It's really not as awkward and as uncomfortable as it can be. I think it's important to be having these conversations because of, like I mentioned earlier, with the nuances of appropriating AAVE and language oppression, that AAVE is something that was created by Black people for Black folks. And so if we are trying to work in solidarity with the Black community, we need to check ourselves first and check those around us. And we can do that by learning about the history of AAVE and sharing the knowledge with others. And I also really like the infographic that I put on the right side. I think that this is a great way to be framing conversations, especially when you're bringing up uncomfortable things like AAVE or calling someone out and calling someone in about their language use.
And adding on to what Mira just said, so something that I asked Mira to do after she called me in to think about my language use was I asked her to, every time that I would say period or use AAV, I asked her to kind of kindly check me. And I'm very grateful that she has done that for me, but I also want to be mindful of who you're asking to do that for you, because for your Black friends or your Black family, that might be something that requires a lot of emotional labor. And so being really mindful who you ask to help check you is important. And then also what one of y'all was saying in the chat, checking people can be uncomfortable, because especially if you're not a confrontational person. So a tip that I would like to share with you all, if you're not super confrontational and don't want to be not you using AAVE right now, you could be hey, do you actually know where that term comes from? The term that you just used, do you want to know the history behind it? Because then it could give you an opportunity to share the history of African-American Vernacular English, which could lead to a whole new conversation about how to stop appropriating it. Today, these are all the sources that we use to make this presentation, as well as more resources on linguistic justice if this is a topic that interests you. So feel free to scan that QR code if you would like. And yeah, so thank you all so much for attending. If you wanted to ask us any more questions or reach out to us, you can email us at cccenter@ucsd.edu. You can also check us out on Instagram, which is at UCSD Cross Cultural Center, or you can also check out our website, which is ccc.ucsd.edu.